Well, there's this idea that by wearing these things, you assume the character and the power and the nobility of the animal. And if you talk to these shamans, they will say, oh yeah, we can actually turn into a killer whale. We can turn into a wolf. We can turn into a raven. And you might say, yeah, right, that's just, old Injun Joe has been drinking too much fire water. Well, no, it's not quite that simple. Because, see, tell you a true story. An old friend of mine, Dr. Chuck Swigert, no relation to Jimmy Swigert, spelled differently. He's a pediatrician, spirit-filled man, and he was doing pro bono work on a Native American reservation in the Pacific Northwest. He'd go there every week and look at the kids, give them checkups, whatnot, take care of their illnesses. And every week, he'd drive out at the end of the day, and there'd be this old, wizened-up Indian woman wrapped in a blanket, and she'd just be glowering at him. If looks could kill, he would have been dead, and his car would have died. She's just glowering at him. Whatever. So week after week, this would happen. And then one day he was driving out of again, this is a guy, he's a doctor, this isn't a flake. And he's driving out, and this lady's standing there, and he said, literally, in the blink of an eye, 1 minute she was there, like that, there was this giant raven standing there. And she was gone. That fast. And then the raven flew away. Now, that's called a skinwalker. That's what Native Americans call it. They can turn into wolves, they can turn into coyotes, they can turn into various other animals. So, this stuff is very real. Let's see, in ancient Egypt, and again, we're talking 3,000 years ago, we see all these portrayals of beings. I'm sure, again, you've seen these on TV with hawk heads, with crocodile heads, with jackal heads, like Anubis is a jackal-headed god, the falcon-headed god Horus. What's this stuff talking about? Where is this coming from? Some of you may have heard of Petronius. He was a Greek author, contemporary of St. Paul's. And basically, he talked about werewolves in his novel, the Satyricon. And he is the first guy to associate them with the full moon. I'm sure most of you have heard the part of the legend that says, and this is from the werewolf film with Lon Chaney Jr., even a boy who is good and says his prayers at night can become a werewolf when the moon turns bright. That's Maria Uspenskaya, the old gypsy. And that isn't really true. The moon, you see, has a long association with evil. And why do you think that is? Just real quickly, I'll share this. It has nothing to do with werewolves. The moon is a symbol of the church. Look at some of the references in the Bible about the moon. Think about it. The moon has no light of its own. It gets its light from what? The sun. Christ is the sun of righteousness. And the moon is imperfect. It has a pockmarked face. That's why we all, there's the man in the moon, Just like the church is an imperfect image of the Son, of the Son of God. Also, what happens when you have a lunar eclipse? The moon goes dark. Why? Because the world gets between the moon and the sun. Just like a Christian goes dark when the world gets between Christ and the Christian. Just a little mini teaching there. Anyway, so that isn't really based in anything. The idea that werewolves can actually turn into a werewolf anytime they want. The term itself comes from the Old English weir, which means man, and wolf, which obviously means wolf. During the Middle Ages, there were many widespread outbreaks of werewolf attacks. And some of this, many people believe, relates to what we today call rabies. That someone would be bitten by a rabid animal, maybe even a wolf or a dog. And, back then, again, these are primitive times, they'd go be, frothing at the mouth and crazy and, whatnot. And they, it's a werewolf, So some of this may very well have been, superstition or whatever. Now, werewolves are larger and stronger than either humans or wolves. So they're like the best and the worst of both species come together. And according to legend, they lose most of their humanity when they turn and develop a ravenous appetite for flesh. Though commonly thought today that you become a werewolf by being bitten by one, this is actually a relatively modern idea. There's actually, believe it or not, a medical condition known as clinical lycanthropy. There are people locked up in mental hospitals today that believe they are wolves. They walk around on all fours, they defecate like animals, they growl, they howl at the moon. And there's also another condition that's called hyperhirsutism. That's a big word. It means basically super hairy. And these are people, usually men, thank goodness, that are really, really, really hairy. I mean, like beyond hairy. And some people think that this might also have been some of the werewolf thing, because these guys look like apes. They're so hairy. So anyhow, that is some of the origins of these things. Then you have in literature, now this is much spottier. There aren't as many novels and things about the werewolf as there are about the vampire. Herodotus wrote about a tribe called the Nerui, and this is 400 BC, that they turn into wolves every 9 years. Ovid talked of men who roamed the woods of Arcadia transforming into wolves in his book Metamorphosis. Interesting name, Metamorphosis. And I already mentioned Petronius' Satyricon, but they haven't gotten a lot of press compared to the vampire. When we look at werewolves in films, it's a little bit punier than the vampire cinema. In fact, it's interesting, you may not know this, but there are the only figure in literature or film who has had more stuff made about him than Dracula is Sherlock Holmes. He's the most popular literary character in history. Dracula's number 2. Werewolves are somewhere further down. But the very first werewolf film was Werewolf of London in 1935. Then the most famous one was The Wolfman with Lon Chaney Jr. That was in 1941. And then there were a few not so notable ones. But then there were the Howling films in 1981 and the sequels. And it's interesting to note that in the Howling film, the original one, that's the first time they ever really showed what a werewolf actually looks like. Because prior to that, like if you see the Wolfman with Lon Chaney, it's a very anthropomorphic wolf. In other words, it basically looks like a guy with a furry mask on. It isn't very impressive, although back then they were very scared by it because, they were much more innocent. In the 1940s, they'd only seen Hitler. But nowadays, the werewolves look a lot more real. They look a lot more like werewolves really look. And some of you may have heard this story, but I was told by colleagues in the Brotherhood of Satan that when you see the transformation in the movie The Howling, which is sort of like about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the movie, of this one character who actually turns into a werewolf on camera, that it's actually a real guy turning into a werewolf because they couldn't get the makeup ready in time. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's interesting because if you watch that film, it will give you an idea of what werewolves really look like because they are extremely scary, unless, of course, you have the blood of the lamb on your side. Let's see. Then in the same year was also an American Werewolf in London. Probably the most big screen actor type character to ever play a werewolf was Jack Nicholson, who is arguably a huge Hollywood star. He starred in 1994 with Michelle Pfeiffer in the movie Wolf. And the Harry Potter films, which are, of course, very popular. A werewolf figures prominently as a hero in the Harry Potter books and films. Then, after the turn of the millennium, we have the Underworld trilogy, as so far there's been 3 of them, which is about a supposed war between werewolves and vampires.